I think the technology seems to be working.
Yes. Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the 6th talk in our International Philosophy Talk series held by the Department of Philosophy at Marmara University here in Istanbul. Today we are honored to have Professor Erik Olson with us, and his talk is entitled Immortality for Non-Believers. I will first give a brief introduction, brief information about our speaker, and then we're going to go on to the talk, and then we're going to have a discussion session afterwards. Erik Olson is a professor of philosophy at the University of Sheffield since 2003. He was at Cambridge before that. Erik's research is primarily in metaphysics and related areas. Topics of interest include personal identity, material objects, time, and death. I think somebody wanted to say something. He is perhaps best known for his research in the field of personal identity and for advocating animalism, the unorthodox view that we are biological organisms. He argues for this view in his book, The Human Animal, Personal Identity Without Psychology, which was published by Oxford University Press. His other book is entitled What Are We? A Study in Personal Ontology, which is also published by Oxford University Press. And I'm just going to name just some of the most recent journal articles that he has published among various publications, such as Parfit's Metaphysics and What Matters in Survival, Narrative and Persistence. In fact, our previous talk was on narrativity as well by Galen Strawson. So that's a coincidence there. Another journal article is The Zombies Among Us. What does it mean to say that we are animals? The metaphysical implications of conjoined twinning, the Epicurean view of death, the extended self, and the rate of time's passage, again, to name just a few among various publications. So please join me in welcoming Professor Erik Olson. The floor is virtually yours, and thank you again for participating in our Philosophy Talk series.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? Good. Okay. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be in Istanbul, if only in a virtual sense. It makes it a little bit easier, I suppose, though less fun. Okay. The talk that I'm going to give is based on a paper that I've been working on and off for a very long time, and I'm still not quite sure what the conclusion of the talk should be. So if any of you have got some suggestions about what I should be concluding, I'd be very, very pleased to hear them. So it's very much a work in progress, and it's a little bit, yeah, I was going to say a little bit messy, not too much, I hope. All right, so we all know the question whether it would be a good thing for us to live forever, or is it better for us to be mortal? And this is one of the old chestnuts in the philosophy of death. And every sort of introduction to this subject contains a section on this topic. It seems that most people would love to live forever, at least given the right sort of life. Of course, nobody would want to spend. Whoops! Now it's not working. Why are my slides not advancing? Sorry. There we go.
Oh,
right.
Okay.
Does that work? Okay,
yes.
Now it's working. Okay, sorry. Nobody, of course, would want to spend eternity burning in the fires of hell, but the right sort of everlasting life is the ultimate goal of most religious believers, and there's no question in their mind that it would be a great blessing. And most people in most times and places have been religious believers. In philosophy, by contrast, the dominant view is that eternal life couldn't possibly be a good thing, or at least not for human beings anyway. We can reasonably wish for a longer life, but it would be foolish to want to live forever. An endless life would inevitably be boring or pointless or shallow or something like that. And those of this opinion have come to be known as immortality curmudgeons. And a much smaller number, you might call them the enthusiasts, have tried to rebut the arguments and show that immortality could be a good thing. But again, this is a minority view in philosophy. And there's a large debate on this subject. Now, you might wonder whether this is a debate worth having. It's pretty clear that we're not going to live forever, and nothing we could ever do would bring it about. So what's the point of speculating about the desirability of something that's never going to happen? It could only be of interest to religious believers who think they actually are going to live forever. But for the rest of us, thinking about what immortality would be like, well, it can seem as idle as thinking about what you do with your money if you were to win the lottery jackpot. Okay, that might be a pleasant way to spend a wet afternoon, but it's not really a serious project. I used to worry about this question. It put me off this topic for a long time, but I think now that there is a point in thinking about immortality, even if we know that we haven't got it. Because if our lives are finite, if we really are mortal, this is one of the most important facts about us. The finitude of our lives is much more important than their length. Things would be very different if we lived for, say, 800 years on average, or 8,000 years instead of 80. That would be, I mean, you'd have to make plans and assess risks and arrange your finances in quite a different way, for example. But this difference is nothing compared to that between living for any finite period and living forever. So our immortality has very important implications. And to understand these implications, we need to know something. We need to know something about the alternative. So to assess the significance of our being mortal, we have to know something about what it would be like if we were not mortal. And this point is not confined to this particular topic, to death. You can't fully understand any state of affairs unless you know something about how things would be if it didn't hold. You need to know something about the alternative. For example, to understand the effect of the Gulf Stream on the climate of Europe, we need to know something about what the climate would be like if the Gulf Stream were to stop, okay, or to slow down. And this is worth thinking about or worth studying, even if the Gulf Stream never does stop. So it needn't be idle for non-believers to think about immortality. Okay, but there's always a but, right? But there are complications to do with what, well, that's what this paper is about. It's about the complications, okay? There are different sorts of immortality and correspondingly different senses of mortality. And the literature does not always distinguish between them. And I think because of this, it gets into well, a certain amount of trouble, which I think could be avoided by thinking more carefully about what immortality actually would be or what it would mean. Okay. Right. So the first complication is this. So I said that most people would love to be immortal, and this is evident in the attitude they take towards their the teachings of their religion. But this sort of immortality is very different from the immortality of the philosophers, as you might call it. The philosophers usually imagine an endless continuation of the sort of life that we know, a sort of a secular immortality, you might call it. Okay, so it's the life we have only just never stops. So it's, you know, it's shopping and it's sports and it's work and rest and all that, you know, all the stuff that we're familiar with. Okay, but by contrast, the sort of immortality that the believers imagine is quite different. They imagine resurrection followed by eternal life in the next world. So the lives we know are going to come to an end, and then we'll somehow be transformed and continue to exist in a conscious state in the next world, in heaven or hell or some other condition of that sort. I'm not sure whether most people would like to have secular immortality. That's an interesting question. Right, so that's what the ordinary people are thinking of. All right, if you look on the internet for an image of heaven, it's very hard. Nearly everything you see is just plain, it's just silly. And this rather old engraving from Gustave Doré is almost the only one that isn't embarrassing. So I'm going to use it. And it just shows how difficult it is to imagine, I suppose, heaven. Whereas hell, that's different. Okay. Right, so the curmudgeons don't usually ask what it would be like to live as an immaterial soul in the direct presence of a theistic God or in some other unimaginable condition. They don't usually argue that that sort of immortality would inevitably be shallow or boring or pointless, that even the saints would one day get enough of the infinite love of God. What they find unattractive is an endless life like the one that we've got. Okay, and it looks right for philosophers to think about secular rather than religious immortality. And one reason is it's very hard to imagine what religious immortality would be like. Can you imagine basking in the direct presence of God, washed forever by luminous waves of infinite love? Well, I can't imagine that, and I'd be very skeptical about any claim by a philosopher to know what that would be like, or any claim to the effect that that would be boring or pointless. And again, the serious philosophical project was to learn about the significance of our mortality by asking what it would be like if we were not mortal. And to ask what it would be like if we were not mortal is to consider the most likely alternative to our being mortal, the alternative where everything else, as far as possible, remains the same. So we need to consider a possible state of affairs that's as much like the actual condition as it can be, or as much like the actual state of affairs as our living forever or not being mortal allows it to be. Okay, so imagine that we live forever, but keep everything else the same as far as you can. Okay, and given the assumption on the part of most philosophers anyway, that there's no God or heaven or hell and so on, this state of affairs should be free from any religious or supernatural elements, or as free as it can be anyway, given the assumption that we are immortal. Okay, so given that assumption, the most likely alternative to our mortality is not a scenario where we're resurrected and then live forever in the direct presence of God. It's something more like our ordinary lives, only without any end. So we should expect philosophers to think about secular immortality. Okay. Of course, it may be that secular immortality is completely impossible. I'm open to that suggestion, but that remains to be shown. Okay, so that's the first complication. The second complication is this. So I said that immortality was worth thinking about because it's the alternative to our actual condition, mortality. Okay, but what is it to be mortal? There are different senses in which we're mortal, at least 3 different senses. So first of all, most obviously, our lives are finite. We're not going to live forever, where by living, I mean existing in a conscious state. Okay, call that finitude. Second, it's not just that we don't live forever, but that we cannot live forever. It's impossible. Okay, it's at least nomologically impossible. It's impossible given the laws of nature and the human condition. Okay, it's our lives have to be finite. We're doomed to die. Okay. not just that we do die. And of course, our being doomed to die implies that we are going to die, but not vice versa. Right? You might, it might be possible to live forever, even though no one actually does. And third, our lives are fragile. Okay, death is possible at any moment. I might die before coming to the end of this sentence. Okay, I'm still here, but this is only due to a certain amount of luck. We're never entirely safe from death. No amount of caution and clean living can make you invulnerable to death. Okay, so we manage to survive only by a certain amount of good luck. And this thought is expressed in the psalm, I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Death is always there waiting for me. Okay, so these are the three different senses of mortality: finitude, doom, and fragility. And these conditions are all different, although there are connections between them, which I think I haven't got time to explore. Okay, so immortality would be, well, there's a different version of immortality corresponding to each of these species of mortality. So if we think about finitude, right, where have we got? Yes. What would our lives be like without this feature? Well, to answer that question, we need to consider a possible situation that resembles the actual situation as much as our living forever allows it to. So what do we get if we subtract the finitude of our lives and leave everything else as much as possible the same? You might think it's Jonathan Swift's story of the Struldbrugs, who have eternal life but not eternal youth. So everything is just as it is in real life, including the fact that age brings frailty and dementia and disease and so on and so forth. And the only thing missing is death. They can never die. But okay, it doesn't take much reflection, I don't think, to see that this is impossible. The story is incoherent. The human being simply cannot age forever physiologically and still remain alive. Okay, what would our lives be like after we aged at the actual rate for 10,000 years? Well, the question has no answer except to say that it couldn't possibly happen. Aging weakens the physiological systems that life consists in and depends on. So, for example, at some point, your diaphragm would lose the strength to draw air into your lungs and you would suffocate. Your liver would no longer be able to eliminate waste from the blood at the rate at which they accumulate, and so on. Any of these things would cause death. The story makes sense only if we ignore all these details. A human being remaining alive despite any amount of aging would be like a building remaining upright despite any amount of weathering. Okay, I think the most likely alternative to the finitude of our lives would be living forever by being immune from the harmful effects of aging. Okay, so everything is just as it is, except that we don't get physically older. The physical causes of aging are not entirely understood, but they seem to be contingent. So certain strands of DNA get shorter, and cosmic rays cause genetic mutations which get inherited by further generations of cells and all that stuff. But it's not obvious that these things have to happen. There are cell lineages that don't show any effects of aging. Perhaps we could be like that. That seems, well, this scenario is at least not obviously impossible. So in that case, we would remain forever youthful in the physiological sense. So our muscles and sinews would keep their strength and our organs would continue to function properly. We might age in the psychological sense of growing more knowledgeable and more experienced and so on, but we would be immune from senile dementia. Okay. we could live forever by being immune to the harmful effects of aging. So age can't kill us by making us more frail and so on. So age does not increase our risk of dying, but there's no immunity to death from the sorts of causes that can strike you down in your prime. Okay, car crashes, poisoning, cancer, suicide, and so on. So we could live forever as long as we manage to avoid things like that. There would always be a risk of death, but the risk would not increase with age as it actually does. Okay, so, and nor would there be any immunity to injury or disability. Okay, so I'm going to call this contingent immortality. Okay, I said that, yes, okay. So that seems to be the alternative to the finitude of our lives. That is the most likely, the sensible alternative, you might say. Okay, what about the second sense of in which we're mortal and that we're doomed to die? If we were not doomed to die, what would that be like? What would it be like if we didn't have to die, but in fact, we do die? Well, I think it would be nearly the same as having contingent. Sorry, it would be, yes, you might call this merely potential immortality. I think it would be nearly the same as contingent immortality. We'd be free. We'd have to be free from the harmful effects of aging, because otherwise it would be impossible for us to live forever. Okay, but although that might make our lives longer, we wouldn't actually live forever. So it would be just like having contingent. So the difference between contingent immortality, where you manage to live forever despite being vulnerable to death, and merely potential immortality is luck, right? If your luck runs out and you die, you've got merely potential immortality. If your luck holds out forever, you've got contingent immortality. Okay, so the difference is not very great. So the aging process doesn't kill us, but something else does. That's what you get if you remove the fact that we have to die and leave everything else as much as possible the same. Okay, you might say this is not really a form of immortality at all because we don't live forever, and that's a fair point. And I mentioned it only for the sake of completeness, but it will be important later on. Okay, what about the fragility of life? Okay, that's the third sense in which we are mortal, that we're always vulnerable to death. What's the alternative to that? Well, if we were not vulnerable to death, then we would be invulnerable to death. It would be impossible for us to die. We wouldn't merely escape death by good luck, but there would be no possibility of it. So I'm going to call this strong immortality. This sort of this is the version of immortality that most commonly features in the philosophical stories about it, and many major figures say this explicitly, like Martha Nussbaum, for example, and Todd May and John Fisher and Samuel Scheffler. And other cases, it's implicit in the consequences that immortality is taken to have. Well, this, by the way, just to help you imagine strong immortality, this is a picture of this little toddler being dipped in the water. This little toddler is Achilles, who was dipped in some special water which gave him immunity to death, except on his heel where his mother is holding him. You all know the story. Okay. Yes. So that we're invulnerable to death is part of most philosophical stories, and it's even when it's not explicitly mentioned, it's implicit in the consequences that it's taken to have. So, for example, it's often said that immortality would not just lengthen our lives, but it would change the quality of our lives at every moment. it would mean, for example, that nothing would have any urgency. So if I don't take that climbing trip this year, for example, it doesn't matter. I can always do it next year, right? Or the year after. I've got endless time and endless opportunity to do these things. So procrastination would have no cost. I could put everything off because I can always do it some other time. I would never have to choose between doing it and not doing it. I would only have to choose between doing it first or doing it second, doing it now or doing it later. Now, whether these claims are correct is a good question, but let that pass. For this to be the case, well, we'd have to be invulnerable to death, because otherwise it wouldn't be safe to put things off. I might be dead next year. In fact, it looks like for this to make a noticeable difference to my life, I'd have to know that I was immortal, that I was going to live forever. Okay, if the gods were to make me immortal without telling me, my life would go on exactly as before. I wouldn't notice the difference. It would still appear to me as if I had to set priorities and make irreversible choices and so on. But I couldn't know that I was going to live forever unless I were invulnerable to death. If I could die at any moment and I survive only by good luck, then I could never be sure, because luck cannot be predicted. And the assumption that immortality would make us invulnerable to death is also implicit in lots of other stories. For example, it's implicit in stories in which we are given the choice of immortality. We're offered immortality as a gift to take or leave, right? If you were vulnerable to death, you could only live forever by good luck, and you can't choose to be lucky. And likewise, the gods could not give you the gift of luck, right? That's just to do with the nature of luck. So in order for you to choose immortality, or for you to be given it as a gift from the gods, it would have to consist in invulnerability to death. Right. And philosophers frequently imagine in these discussions that we're invulnerable not just to death, but to a whole lot of other calamities as well, like debilitating illness or injury. Because I mean, if at any moment I could have a stroke that left me paralyzed on one side, then a lot of my plans and projects would be just as fragile as they would be if I were in constant danger of dying. So I couldn't put off that climbing trip without penalty, because for all I know, next year I might not be able to go climbing, or even to walk at all, or to get out of my wheelchair. So the urgency would be right back in my life. But in the immortality of the philosopher's imagination, these worries are rarely present or rarely mentioned. But if they were possible, immortality would be a lot like real life. Okay, so yes, right, I just said that. Okay. So these are the three main kinds of mortality and the three versions of immortality that are the alternatives to them. Okay, so, and I said that the sort of immortality that figures most often in the philosophers' discussions is strong immortality. This seems to me unfortunate, because strong immortality seems to be impossible, seems to be logically impossible. How could a human being be invulnerable to death? We are biological organisms, or at least we're biological entities in some sense. And it's hard enough to imagine a biological organism living forever, given all the ways in which it could die, but that's nothing compared to trying to imagine a biological organism that could not be killed. Just think of all the organs and physiological systems that have to function in a very precise way to keep you alive. Think of all the possible causes of death that the medics know about. It doesn't take very much kill an organism. So how could that be completely impossible? Or again, imagine that I drive my motorcycle at high speed into a concrete wall. Now, there might be a very small chance that I might walk away from the wreckage without any serious harm. Maybe, okay. But how could such an outcome be inevitable? How could it be impossible for me to kill myself or to die by this sort of accident? Or again, how could I play Russian roulette with no risk to my life? All right. Lots of these discussions envisage a situation where our invulnerability to death is contingent and reversible. So for example, there's a potion that makes you immune to death, but which can be reversed by taking an antidote. There's the antidote, okay. And this seems to be the situation. This seems to be the situation in lots of stories, like the Borges story, the Immortals, for example, or in Bernard Williams' Macropolis case. It's not part of the story that the characters can die of any other cause, by accident or suicide or whatever, right? If that were possible, they wouldn't need to find the antidote to the immortality potion, and the whole point of the story would be lost. You might call this voluntary immortality, where our invulnerability to death can be reversed by taking an antidote to the immortality potion, for example. And the appeal of this sort of means of escape is obvious. So if we were necessarily invulnerable to death, that would mean that we're going to live forever whether we like it or not. And that's a rather frightening prospect. I don't know whether eternal life would inevitably become undesirable in some way, but it certainly could. And the longer I live, the more likely it would be that my life would somehow turn sour. But if there were no possible escape from that life, well, that would be the worst thing imaginable. So if my life were to become unbearable, there would be no possible escape. And I wouldn't really, well, yes, that would be awful. Offered the gift of irreversible immortality, it might seem wise to decline because the risk would be so great. But voluntary immortality would give us all the benefits of invulnerability to death, but without that risk. So that would enable us to live just as long as we liked. Okay, so it would offer all the benefits of strong immortality, but without the risk. So it's you can understand why somebody might want to discuss this if you want to argue that immortality couldn't possibly be a good thing, because this seems like the best form of it that there could possibly be. But again, voluntary immortality seems to be even more obviously incoherent than strong immortality. Suppose that there really were that no accident could ever do you serious harm. In that case, what means could you use to destroy yourself? How could you possibly end your life if it couldn't possibly end by accident? If I could be strapped to an exploding nuclear warhead and walk away unharmed, what means would I use to end my life? And how could that means be impotent if used against anybody else? It just doesn't seem to, it's incoherent, right? Okay, so this seems, voluntary immortality, although it's often discussed, seems to be impossible. So there may not be very much point in thinking about that, or at least if you are going to think about it, you need to be aware that it's logically incoherent. All right. Yes, okay, I'm getting close to the end now. Let's see. So I want to come back now to contingent immortality. Right. this seems to me the most sensible version of immortality for the philosophers to think about. And it is sometimes mentioned and used as an example in the literature, but I think it's not sufficiently understood. I think this situation is, well, it has some surprising features that I think are important. So again, contingent immortality is living forever while remaining vulnerable to death by being free from the harmful effects of physical aging. Okay. Yes. So death can't kill us by making us frail or more susceptible to illness and so on, but there's no immunity to other misfortunes, okay, like accidents and poisoning and murder and so on. So there's no guarantee of our living forever. Okay. In fact, it would be absurdly improbable that we would live forever. Okay. So suppose my chance of dying within any 100-year period were 1 in 10, just for the sake of argument. Okay. In that case, my chance of living for a century would be 90%. Okay. My chance of living for 1,000 years, if I've done my sums properly, would be 35%. My chance of living for 10,000 years drops down to 0.003%. Okay, 3 in 1,000. Is that right? No, 3 in 10,000. So anyway, yeah. Okay, and my chance of living for 100,000 years is less than 1 in 10 to the power of 46, and so it goes on. Okay. For any number of years, I would have some chance of living that long, but that chance would approach 0 as the period increased. And it follows that my chance of living forever, if I had contingent immortality, would be 0. Okay, in fact, it would be 0 no matter what, no matter how small the risk of dying during any finite period. Okay, as long as that risk remains constant anyway. So my chance of living forever would be the same as my chance of tossing a coin, a fair coin, at regular intervals forever and never losing. It's mathematically possible, but the chance of its happening is 0. Okay, or to give another analogy, imagine that you had a perfectly sharp dart and you threw it at a dartboard. So the dart has to hit some point on the board, but the chance of its hitting any particular point is 0, right? Because there are an infinite number of them. In fact, an uncountable infinity in this case. Okay. You might suppose that the chance is not 0, but infinitesimal. It doesn't matter for present purposes which of these is the case. That's a controversy for the mathematicians. Okay, and in fact, this is the same, that our chance of living forever would be 0 in the commonly imagined case of voluntary immortality, where we're invulnerable to death by any cause except suicide. That too would give you a 0 chance of living forever, because there would always be a risk, a non-zero chance of your choosing to end your life within any given period. And no matter how small that risk, the probability that it would happen eventually, sooner or later, would approach 1 as the period increased, right? So the longer you live, the nearer the chance would be, the chance of your living forever would diminish and would come arbitrarily close to 0. Okay, so the longer that you live, the greater would be the chance that at some point you would decide to do yourself in. For you to have a non-zero chance of living forever, suicide would have to be impossible. There would have to be no chance of it during a given finite period. And in fact, it's impossible to have a chance of living forever that's between 0 and 1, as long as the chance of dying in any finite period remains constant anyway. Okay, So being invulnerable to death gives you a chance of living forever of one. It's inevitable. Being vulnerable to death makes it possible for you to live forever, but the chance of it ever happening is zero. Okay. All right. So what does this mean? So this is my last slide. If we had contingent immortality, it would be a safe bet that we weren't going to live forever. Okay. And I'd be justified in believing that I was eventually going to die. Of course, that might be false, but I'd be justified in believing it. Right? Just as I'd be justified in believing that if I continued tossing a coin forever, I would eventually lose. Okay. In fact, I'd be justified in believing that everybody else was going to die as well, that nobody was going to live forever, right? Because the chance that anyone would live forever would also be zero, as long as the number of people is finite, at least. Okay. And this means that, well, that from my point of view, contingent immortality would be no different from a finite life free from aging. Okay, it would be indistinguishable to us from mere potential immortality. Okay, and well, that would make some difference, I suppose, but it wouldn't be a difference that you could detect. And this is not the sort of immortality that philosophers, this is the sort of immortality that philosophers ought to think about, I've argued, but it's not the sort that's usually discussed in the literature. And a lot of the complaints about immortality that the curmudgeons have got simply don't apply to contingent immortality. If I had time, I'd go and I'd talk in detail about those complaints, but that's a bit of a long story. And yes, you'll have to wait for some other occasion. So yes, so yes, so what's the conclusion? The conclusion that I'm arguing for, I guess, is that contingent immortality that I've been describing is the most likely alternative to the sort of immortality that we have. Okay, it seems to be the only one that's possible, at least without some sort of religious element that we ruled out at the beginning. Okay, but this sort of immortality is quite different from the sort that usually figures in the imagination of the philosophers. All right, I'll stop at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you too, Eric. That was great. Would you like to take a few minutes, or shall we just go on to discussion?
I don't mind. I'm still feeling reasonably fresh, I think.
Okay. All right then. Yes, I see the participants, and if they raise their hands, I can just kind of, in order to avoid confusion, call out their names and they can ask their questions. So I'm just looking here. All right. As I wait for people to kind of come up with their questions, let me just say, ask something here. Now, of course, when you talk about whether it be contingent immortality or maybe any other form of immortality, your views about, of course, I remember that, for instance, you have argued against the possibility of transhumanism, like uploading consciousness and whatnot. So that is not an alternative in your scenario, I believe, because you wouldn't remain to be the same person. Therefore, you wouldn't be living forever if your consciousness was uploaded in some form.
Okay. Yes, that I do think that it's, yes, when you talk about your consciousness being uploaded, that's a sort of dark phrase because it's not very clear what it means. But for that to help you, I mean, if you could upload yourself into a computer, if you could make yourself, if you could shed your biological nature and become a wholly inorganic electronic being in a computer, so to speak, I take it that's what you mean by uploading your mind, uploading yourself.
Yes, I mean, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. That would, I mean, I don't think that's metaphysically possible, but setting that aside, I don't want to rely on that argument, all right? I needn't rely on it, okay? Even if that were metaphysically possible, it still wouldn't make you invulnerable to death, right? It would make you invulnerable to death by heart attack or poisoning, or motorcycle crash and so on, but you could still die by having the power cut off, or by short circuit or something like that, right? By some other means, and it's just as difficult to imagine if you think about it. Imagine an electronic person, supposing that's possible, being invulnerable to death, as to imagine a biological organism that's invulnerable to death. Okay, so it might reduce the risk of dying in a 100-year period, let's say, but it can't reduce it to zero. And it doesn't matter how much you reduce it, as long as the risk is still there, you still got a zero chance of living forever. Mm-hmm. So it might give you a longer life, but it won't give you more than a zero chance of living forever.
Okay, and the case for contingent immortality, you want to keep things as pretty much as much, as the same as much as possible, right?
Yes.
And yet still, I mean, because the contingent immortality is pretty much like living a very long, a very healthy life.
Yes, that's what it'd be like. What it would be like from our point of view. You would remain at least healthy. Well, you would remain healthy. You'd remain free of fatal diseases anyway. Okay, and that would go on forever and ever and ever. But of course, you never get to forever. So at each point in your life, you would have lived for only a finite period, and you would have no way of knowing how much more time you had. Right. For all you knew, of course, you might get hit by a bus tomorrow, or have your power socket pulled out or whatever. Okay. So you could never know that you were going to live forever, and it would be, as you say, just like an unusually long life, free from, and made possible by being free from the ravages of age. Yes.
Okay, I'll just stop and Peter.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for the talk. Very, very nice talk. I have a rather small question. It seems to me that there is also implicitly in what you're thinking about the assumption that time doesn't come to an end, right? If there was a last moment in time, right, then we would just be talking about very long lives that come at the end when entropy is maximal, or shorter lives. So it seems if one talks about living forever, that one is assuming in that option that there's no last moment in time, and that's how easy is it for you to accept? I mean, you've made so many objections against, you've brought so many objections against ideas of immortality. Isn't that an additional issue, a heavy metaphysical or scientific assumption that people who talk about immortality and take it seriously are making? Thank you.
Yes, good. Yeah. That's a very good point. Yes. Of course, for you to live forever, or for anything to go on forever, time has to go on forever, Okay, and the physical universe has to go on forever or something like that. These things are presupposed by any version of living forever, okay, apart from merely potential immortality. Anyway, so I didn't talk about them because they apply to all the versions, and I was just I was talking about trying to distinguish them. They also presuppose that the physical universe will always remain hospitable to life, which we know is not the case, or at least we as far as we know anyways, that's not the case. And of course, you might say we could live forever in some sort of immaterial condition, but of course we know that we're not immaterial, or so it seems anyway. It doesn't seem possible for us to become immaterial, and even if we were even if all the philosophers of mind are mistaken and we actually are immaterial, as the Cartesians believe, that still wouldn't by itself guarantee everlasting life, because even if our being immaterial wouldn't by itself rule out our perishing, and even if it did, it wouldn't rule out our losing the ability to be conscious, losing the sort of whatever sort of psychological continuity our existence requires, or whatever. Okay, so yes, I agree.
Okay, thank you.
Erdal Hocam.
Okay, thank you for great presentation. Actually, I think the problem of mortality and immortality is related to the question, what am I? According to answer to this question, I think we can answer the, we can talk about the problem mortality and immortality in different way. I am curious about your opinion. If we think we are the totality of our action, how can we talk about the problem of immortality when we answer the question, what am I, by saying that I am the totality of my action? For instance, we can, as an artist, we can create a great artwork. After our death, the artwork continue to exist. When we talk about the artwork, generally refers to its artist. So, in which, under which variety of immortality you can put this kind of immortality?
Okay, so your thought is that you might be immortal through your work.
Yeah.
Yes. This seems to me to be a metaphorical sort of immortality. I'm reminded of the Woody Allen joke where he says, "I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality by not dying." And that's the sort of immortality that most people think about. That's the one that the religious believers believe in. That's the one that most of us want. I mean, it would be nice to be immortal through my work, so to speak. I would love to have philosophers reading my books and papers 1 million years from now, and 10 million years, and so on forever. But that's not the same as wanting to live forever, to continue existing and remain conscious forever. And of course, we also, as the previous questioner mentioned, you're not going to be, well, even your work is not going to survive forever, because eventually the earth will be swallowed up by the sun, and our civilization will die away, and the universe will become inhospitable to life, and so on. Does that answer your question, or
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that's right. So my second question is about the conception of time. For instance, when we talk about mortality, immortality, actually we by supposing the some kind of conception about time, we think about the problem. let's, for instance, let's accept the Leibnizian conception of time. According to Leibniz, the time, the concept of time is related to the relation between the things. Before the things, there was no time, etc. So if we think like Leibniz, can we still talk about, immortality and mortality?
I take it Leibniz's view is that time just consists in temporal relations and before and after and so on. So as long as things keep happening, time continues.
Yeah.
If nothing further were to happen, if there were no more changes, no events happening, then there would be no more time, I suppose.
Right.
So yes, again, as Peter Baumann was saying, for you to live forever, time would have to continue forever, and that would imply, well, both the persistence of time and, of course, your persistence require there to be stuff going on forever. Your life would have to continue forever. And of course, your life consists in changes and happenings and events. I'm not sure whether I'm addressing your question now, though.
Yeah, my question is about the relation between time and mortality and immortality. Yeah, if we think, yeah, you answered.
Sorry, I'm losing the audio.
Sorry, I think I have a bad connection. Okay, sorry. Okay.
Go ahead.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I said, our answer to the question, the problem of mortality is based on a kind of conception of time, I think. For instance, let's suppose if we think like Newton, time is absolute. Or if we think like Leibniz, time is not absolute, related to the relation between the things. So our thinking of the mortality and immortality, I think can change according to this conception. So what is the relation between time and this problem?
Okay, I don't think it makes any difference. Immortality presupposes that time never stops, that it always keeps going, and that your life always keeps going, and that there's always change. I don't think it matters whether time requires change, as Leibniz thought, or whether it's independent of change, as Newton thought.
But for
connection, I'm not seeing it.
Okay. For enough. For me, it's enough. Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. Yes, Peter again. Yeah. Your audio is off, I think, Peter.
It still happens to me after all these months. Sorry. Yeah, if no one else wants to ask a question, I would like to ask Eric about the dualist option. I mean, I really don't find that attractive at all for all kinds of reasons. The idea that we are our souls, not our bodies, like Plato and Aristotle thought, and the soul goes on after the physical death and is indestructible. And I myself, and I wonder how you think about this, Eric. I myself would just want to dismiss this option as insufficiently spelled out, as not really intelligible enough. So people would have to add much more detail to this before it's even discussed discussable, but that's a somewhat unsatisfactory response to a theoretical option. And I wonder whether you can think of a better way of putting aside the indestructible soul theory as one option.
Okay, the current written version of the paper has a section on this sort of Cartesian immortality, as you might call it, and what it says is roughly this: that first of all, it doesn't seem to be true that we are immaterial thinking substances. Second, even if it were true, it wouldn't really make any difference to the point that I'm making, because it wouldn't guarantee us eternal life. We'd still be vulnerable to death, it seems anyway, or at least we'd still be vulnerable to death, unless perhaps there was some sort of omnipotent God making sure that nothing bad happens to us, keeping us in existence or whatever. But for all I know, that's possible even on a materialist view. Maybe an omnipotent God could keep us living forever, make us invulnerable to death, even if we're material things, by infallibly protecting us from illness and injury and all the things that could end our lives. So they're both. So it doesn't really. It doesn't affect the point that I want to make. It doesn't solve any problems to suppose that, well, it doesn't solve very many problems. It doesn't get us very far to suppose, however implausibly, that we're immaterial. Does that sound right, or have you got a better suggestion?
No, I thought you had a better. I thought you had a better one, because I'm kind of helpless against people who say the soul is indestructible. It's simple. It can't be destructed, and that could be going on forever if time has no end. And the best thing I can think of in reply to that is to say that is just apart from unbelievable. It's just not. You haven't given me enough detail about that picture. I don't know what you're talking about, and I was hoping you might have something stronger as a possible dismissal, because if you assume that the soul is indestructible, I mean, then it's built into it seems to be built into the idea of that soul, that it cannot end its existence. And you know, that's stretching things so far, and that's so abstract that I can't think of anything else than to say, look, this is a pretty meager conception of life too. I mean, what would that be? Life? What would you be doing? But
yes, good. Yes, I think I'd rather not try and argue that our being immaterial would mean that that immortality would be undesirable, because perhaps we could be given the right sort of bodies and so on, something like the way that we actually are. Of course, I might challenge someone to argue that we are immaterial, and if we are immaterial, that makes us indestructible. That's a further claim. No one's got. I've never seen a good argument for either, particularly for the second claim. But I think what I would say at the end of the day in this context is that it doesn't affect the point that I was trying to make. Let me put it differently. It may be, hasn't been shown, but it may be that this is the only possible way in which we could have strong immortality. The only way in which we could have more than a zero chance of living forever, if we're indestructible Cartesian souls. Maybe so. That remains to be shown. And it would be very interesting if that were the case, and that might. I mean, this is not something that is acknowledged in the discussions between the curmudgeons and the enthusiasts. So I don't want to dismiss it, although I'm very skeptical for various reasons, just as you are. But I want to be, I want to make as few enemies as as possible.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Ali Said Hocam has a question, and then there's another question in the chat box. So let's start with Ali Said Hocam.
Okay, thank you. First,
I can't hear
I
you.
can't hear Ali Said Hocam, we can't hear you.
could you hear me? Could you hear me?
Yes, now, yes, but let's see how it goes.
This is great, Eric. Also, I benefit very much from your presentation. Even I didn't understand very well the conclusion.
Oh, I've lost the audio again.
Very good. But yeah, my question is going to go directly to ethical implication of your presentation.
Okay.
If I didn't miss, you didn't talk about this problem, and I think if you follow the Kantian argumentation, I think this problem is purely metaphysical question, right? According to the first critic. So if we take the problem of immortality or mortality in the view of the theoretical and scientific reason, but otherwise, there is a question of morality of immortality or mortality. If we take your term of contingency of immortality, what could moral conclusion of this conception? What would it be if we take seriously immortality? So I think this is a real point of discussion, because in scientific view, I think we do not have a lot of information about immortality. We prefer to stay agnostic. I think there is really the ethical problem it could be. So if we take the immortality, all of the relation and the relation of human with nature could change, right? So in general, I ask this question: what could be ethical conclusion of this conception of immortality?
Okay, I was only able to hear about half of what you said, so I'll start talking, and if I stray from your question, please say so, and I'll stop, and you can set me straight. So I think you're asking, what are the moral implications of our being immortal on any of these conceptions? Is that your
exactly.
question? I haven't thought about that. Largely because I haven't actually taken part in these debates between the curmudgeons and the enthusiasts and so on. I've been trying to step back from that. I suppose if it's impossible for you to die, that would have certain sort of practical implications. It would mean that murder was impossible, for example. And whereas if we had a merely contingent immortality, of course, it wouldn't seem to make a lot of difference, except, well, it would be possible for you to die. It would mean, I suppose, that risk of death would be much more serious. I mean, if I endanger your life in the actual situation, you're risking a few decades of life. Whereas if you could live forever, then I could be endangering, and I endanger your life, I could be depriving you of an infinite number of years, and that would make it much, much worse. Maybe it's interesting actually that you mentioned Kant. Kant, as you know, thought that we had to be immortal in order for morality to make sense, and in order for our bad actions to be punished, so that there's justice in the
Yes.
cosmos. And I haven't actually thought about what sort of, well, there has to be some sort of life after death anyway. I haven't thought about what sort of immortality this would require. Maybe it does. Maybe it would require strong immortality, because otherwise, if you were vulnerable to death, it would still be possible for you to die and cease to exist, and that would prevent justice from being served. You wouldn't. You might escape justice by ceasing to exist in the next world, just as you might in this world. So it sounds like Kantian immortality must be strong immortality. Have I addressed your question, or have I missed it?
Thank you very much. Yeah, we did.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, the Alexander's question, shall I read it? It's in the chat box. I'll just read it. Consider a scenario where we are contingently immortal, in your sense. Now, suppose that whenever you die, a clone of you, which is perfectly continuous with you in terms of memory and any other mental, physical properties, comes into being. This seems to me an interesting case. The Cartesian Lockean would probably say that this comes close to strong immortality. An animalist, on the other hand, would not agree. Any thoughts on this?
Okay, so there's a metaphysical question here as to whether the copy of me made after my death would be me. There's a funny science fiction story based on this premise by Stanislaus Lem, the name which I can't remember, I'm afraid, but I recommend it. I'll try and dig it up, and if you were just interested, and I could email it to you. I mean, it seems to me that if I'm hit by a bus or have a heart attack and die or whatever, that's the end. And you can make a copy of me if you like, but that's going to be somebody else, and his living is not going to be my living. So that's what I would say at the end of the day. But even if that's wrong, even if my argument here is not, well, I would prefer it not to rely on my metaphysical convictions in other areas. So the thought is effectively, whatever anything bad happens to me that threatens my life, I can always be fixed up and carry on as before. That's what the scenario amounts to. Okay, and you can imagine it doesn't have to involve destruction followed by a copies being produced. It could just be that, you know, whenever I get into a bad accident, the medics are able to fix me up. It wouldn't make you invulnerable to death. It wouldn't make me invulnerable to death, because the medics might not always be there. There would always be a chance that they wouldn't be able to fix me up, or that the copy or clone wouldn't be produced. So unless somehow the fixing up process or the cloning process were infallible, I'd still have a 0 chance of living forever. Does that sound right?
She says she can't open the mic, so I maybe she will.
I can, if she would like to write something, I can see it in the chat bar.
Yeah, I think yes. Thank you is the reply. Yeah. I mean, following up on that, is it possible to keep, you said you want to keep your metaphysical inclinations, you want to keep them independent from this sense of immortality.
I didn't want to rely on them if I didn't, if I don't have to.
Well, that's what I was kind of concerned with, and this question also kind of reminds me of that. I mean, I somehow think that they cannot be taken apart because well, if, for instance, let's going back to this question also, I can make use of this question, you know, just cloning, copying, whatever. Let's say it's possible. So you're saying your view is that it's not possible, that it's not the same you, so you don't actually continue to exist. But you don't want this view to have any impact on the discussion here, on the immortality. So let's say cloning happened and for some reason you take it that you continue to exist. And you're saying that this view on animalism, whatever, doesn't have any impact on immortality because there's still a scenario in which that clone or that machine, you know, you in the computer or whatever, we can still make up themes according to which you can turn it off or turn it on, or in that way you still have the discussion of being able to live forever or not being able to live forever. Am I understanding that correctly? Is that how they come apart?
Yes, or to put it differently, even if I concede for the sake of argument that these things are possible, contrary to my metaphysical arguments, the point is this, the point that I'm making now is the same. Right? That would still give you at most contingent immortality.
And the point you're making is when we think about immortality, when we ask philosophical questions about immortality, is immortality a good thing or whatever, we should be thinking about contingent immortality. That's the, is that the...
Well, that's a little bit too simple, but well, that seems to be the most likely alternative, right? If you remove the fact that we die and that we have to die, that's what you get. Unless you add something else, that's what you get. That's so imagine that we don't die, but keep everything else as far as possible the same. Well, my answer to that is, well, you remove the harms from aging so that we can live forever, and you get very lucky and you do live forever. That's what it will be like to live forever, unless you add something else, like being invulnerable to death.
I see. I mean, wouldn't that be, wouldn't one say that's not immortality, that's being mortal and being very lucky at the same time, something like that?
Okay, yes, well, again, there are different things that you could mean by mortal and immortal, and I distinguish three different categories. So this is a sense in which you could live forever, right? So this is a scenario in which you live forever. So you're immortal in that sense, that is, you're immortal in that your life is not finite. Okay, and I said that at the beginning, that the most obvious sense in which we're mortal is that we're not going to live forever, that our lives are finite. Okay, so if you remove that, you get, but don't add anything else, you get contingent immortality. Okay, and even the immortality scenario that's perhaps most often imagined, or very often imagined, is that's what I call voluntary immortality, where you take the immortality potion, and that makes you invulnerable to death as long as until you take the antidote anyway, that also gives you zero chance of living forever. So, and yet everybody takes that to be a form of immortality. That's the sort that Williams and Borges and all those people are talking about. But it depends on what you mean by immortality, and that's part of the theme of my talk, I suppose. It can mean different things, but ideally we ought to be clear about what we mean, rather than just launching into a discussion without being very clear.
Okay, there's another question, Karim Hocam.
Thank you, but maybe I should not. Erdar Hoca, this is his second hand. So his second hand is before my hand.
No, it's the second hand, but after you, Karim Hocam. Yeah, go on.
Thank you. My question, thank you for the presentation, Eric. It's fair, it's, how can I say, just to say very general. I'm curious as to whether you personally, I mean, having gone through the literature, you have any sort of explanation as to whether the focus is so much on strong immortality rather than contingent immortality, or why contingent has been ignored? Has it never been articulated, or is it just that everyone's concerned about strong immortality? And I mean, I find it, maybe just by way of elaborating the motivation, is it seems to me that contingent immortality is can be, I mean, thinking about it can be more enlightening in terms of understanding the value of our life or the meaning of our life when compared to thinking about strong immortality. I mean, that we are vulnerable is okay, part of being human, but being so invulnerable also seems to be less informative. Being somewhat invulnerable seems to be more informative. I mean, just my thoughts. I'm interested in if you have any kind of explanation as to whether the literature is so focused on the strong one.
Yes, okay. It's not quite the case that it's so focused on that. It's very often presupposed either explicitly or implicitly, but either knowingly or not knowingly. Some philosophers explicitly distance themselves from that and say that they're talking about that they're not taking us to be invulnerable to death, but I think they haven't worked out what the implications of that are. They haven't noticed that means that we've got a zero chance of living forever. And as to why this is the case, I suspect it's just because people haven't thought about it. Well, you know how philosophers tend to be. They take a question and they run with it without getting completely clear about what the question was before they started trying to answer it. Sorry, that's maybe not a very helpful diagnosis, but that's about the best I can do, I think.
Thank you. I thought maybe there is something, I don't know, maybe something that has to do with the implications that some draw. Why the motivation, how people have motivated answering the question, or maybe it has to do, maybe it can be a simple historical event, maybe it's triggered a question in everyone. I don't know, I'm just a general interest.
Not sure, it's a very good question. Some of the more spectacular implications, some of the more interesting implications that immortality has been claimed to have apply only to strong immortality. So that's a reason to think about that version. And it makes things simpler, I suppose. Maybe that's the one whose implications is easiest to work out. But so much in this literature is just not very careful and precise, to my mind, it seems, both the sense of immortality at stake, and also even the arguments that the curmudgeons and the enthusiasts give seem to me really quite quick and dirty, and not, seems like they could be a lot more careful and precise to me. But I haven't got anything wiser than that to say.
Thank you.
Erdal Hocam.
Thank you, Sinem Hocam. Yeah, my question is about the conception of our conception of death. Generally, we think that in the future we will die. So after the death, if we, generally speaking, if we continue to live in, the next world or, another world, so we can be immortal, according to dualist or some religious explanation. But if we change our conception of that, like Heidegger said, for instance, we will not die in the future. Actually, when we were born, we get started to die. So in each day, maybe in each minute, we die, but not really die. So in one sense, we die, but in other sense, we don't die. So can we say, in this sense, we are mortal, but and also immortal. So if we put the conception of that like this, what can you tell us about the problem of immortality or mortality?
Yeah, I don't know Heidegger very well because I could never understand what he said. I could never understand either Heidegger or Heidegger's expositors. It's rather opaque to me. But I suppose, yes, if there's a sense in which we die or start dying from the moment we're born, and another sense in which we die, when our heart stops beating and when our physiological functions and mental functions stop, then we just need to distinguish between the two and ask separate questions about, so there are some questions about the importance of the fact that we die in Heidegger's sense, and other questions about the significance of the fact that we die in the non-Heideggerian sense. And I don't know, perhaps you can tell me what is the Heideggerian sense, and in what sense do I start to die as soon as I'm born?
Yeah, I just thinking loudly. Actually, I haven't thought a lot about these things, but generally when we talk about the mortality and immortality, we said that will happen to us in a time in the future.
Yes.
So, but we fix the time of death, and we say in future this will happen to us. But he changed the conception of that. He says,
yes,
there is no fixed date, and we are not going towards that.
Yeah.
But when we were born, we started to die, but not exactly. We can, we continue to exist as well. So we pass the chain of time, but when we pass the chain of time, we die, and we still to continue exist. So here, mortality and immortality, has different sense, I think.
Yes. Okay. I've been talking about death in the sense, in the traditional non-Heideggerian sense, the sense in which the death consists in ceasing to exist, okay, or at least ceasing permanently to be conscious, something like that, so some event which happens in the future, in our case. And I've said nothing about the Heideggerian sense of death.
Okay.
That's all left open, and I can't say anything about it until I know more about until I know what it is. So I'd be very happy if you could explain it to me, and then I can think about it and perhaps answer your question. But until then, I can't say anything.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yes, I had again. Ali Said Hoca, let me yeah, I'll ask it later. Ali Said Hocam?
Could you hear me? Could you hear me now? Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
My second question will be about the actually religious question. I don't know, but the word of immortality, if we take semantically, is it not related to religious vocabulary? Because your title is immortality for unbelievers, right?
Mm.
So what do you think about that? If we take the term as which has the origin in the history. So could we use the term without history of the term, or we can take the term, just the term? Yes, what will you think about it? Thank you.
Yes, I didn't get all of that because the sound kept dropping out, but I think you're asking whether
I think my connection is bad. I am sorry. I'm very sorry.
Yeah. I understand it because it's often the case that you get a bad connection in these situations. When I try and give lectures to my students, my connection often drops out, and it's it's a real pain. Anyway, I think you're asking whether it makes sense to talk about immortality without taking on board all this historical baggage about the theological, the religious sense of the word.
Yeah.
Something like that, yes. I hope
Right.
I can. I think, but I mean, I was talking about, maybe I could have been more careful about this in the talk, but death in the sense of ceasing to exist. So to live forever is to continue existing in a conscious state forever. Okay, I think we can understand what that means. And I don't think the meaning of that, of what I just said, is infected with religious content or with historical baggage. We could understand that question even if we had never heard of any religious beliefs, and we didn't know anything about history, or even if there hadn't been any history. So although the word immortality may well be infused with religious connotations, I think there is a sort of a neutral metaphysical sense that can be distilled from it. And that's the sense in which that I was trying to talk about, or trying to use. Is that any help?
Well, you think generally this term could be taken without historical baggage, right? If I
Yes.
understand well.
Yes.
I'm sorry, it cuts us here.
Yes, I think I can.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I can define
Okay,
the crucial terms in this debate: mortality, immortality, death, and so on, in a clear way that doesn't have any religious or historical implications. I hope I can, anyway.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the questions. I have another question. Have you seen this movie called The Bothersome Man? It's
No.
a European movie where, I think from Denmark, there's this guy who ends up in some place. And as it turns out, this is a place where phenomenal consciousness is gone. Everything is the same, but there's no what it's like to be in being these mental states. So like zombies, everything is normal. People go to work, have dinner parties and all that, but no phenomenal consciousness. And this guy gets fed up with it and tries to kill himself because somehow he, I guess, comes from a world where a regular world where there was phenomenal consciousness. We don't know. It's not shown in the movie. But what my question is, this guy in the movie tries to commit suicide, does everything he can to end his life, but cannot. The next morning, he throws himself in front of a train. The next morning, he finds himself in bed again, cured and everything. So, I mean, your talk kind of reminded me of that as perhaps maybe some example of immortality, and pretty close to perhaps contingent immortality. It doesn't show a possibility where he could die, but as I said, he finally gets punished for something he did, because there's some, well, let me not go into details here, but at some point he gets punished. And the punishment is like taking him to another place where there is only like wind, cold, and it's white. I just wanted to mention this because maybe it might be useful, I don't know, to, I don't know whether that would be contingent immortality or, because it seems pretty much like it. Everything seems to be the same. It's just these people cannot get hurt somehow. I don't know about the sickness part though, the aging. We don't see those details in the movie. But yeah, I mean.
It sounds like a scenario in which the people are invulnerable to death. They're at least invulnerable to death by any of the usual causes, so that they can't die in an accident, they can't die at their own hand, they can't, I don't know, maybe they can't die from poisoning, and so on. And that's because, yes, and how is that possible? Well, because somehow they're miraculously healed whenever something like this happens. So they jump off the bridge and they're smashed to bits, but only they're not quite, but the bits are instantly put back together again, or something like that, so that they cannot die. Yes, and I suppose this is something that you sometimes see in fiction. I suppose that doesn't this happen in one of those Terminator films? That the yes. Well, what should I say about that? Well, it's, of course, whether this is in any sense possible is I'm not sure. There are plenty of stories which have hidden incoherences. It's certainly not the most likely alternative to the actual situation. It's not clear whether it's possible. It's not clear how it happened. It's not clear what ensures that the characters never die. It sounds like that I don't know. If you ask me to guess how it works, I would say, well, it looks like there's some sort of guardian angels at work, or some sort of beings with supernatural powers who, for some reason, don't want anybody to die, and so they ensure that no one does.
Yeah.
So there's a religious element in this story.
So would you think that's like that would be more of an example of a strong immortality?
Looks like it. It's yes, whether it's strong immortality in the sense that I defined depends on whether these whatever powers it is that stop you from dying are infallible. Well, there's any chance of death, and that's left unspecified by the story as you told it, I suppose. But it's certainly, it's not, I don't know, it doesn't just take away our vulnerability to death and leave everything else the same. It doesn't take away the fact that we die and we leave everything else the same anyway. It seems to take away the fragility of life as well. I don't know whether that's helpful or not.
I just threw it out there because I mean, I don't know how it would fit exactly.
It changes a lot of things besides the fact that we die anyway. Yes, yes, it sounds like the way I described strong immortality, though the details are not quite specified, and it seems to be impossible in the very same way, though in the story it is possible because of some miracle that takes place in the background.
Yeah, I mean, the punishment itself seems like some form of death, because it kind of makes you think, you know, how else could this life be worse? And then comes this punishment, which might be movie, at least, of death. Of course, this is, I mean, a movie, but
I suppose that shows the risks of having strong immortality. If you cannot possibly die or cease to exist or cease to be conscious, then there's a risk that your life might become intolerable, and then there would be no possible escape.
Mm-hmm. And would you consider, for instance, I think this kind of goes back to some of the questions asked earlier. If there were no change, would that be death?
If there were no change, I suppose so. I mean, if there's no change, then there's no conscious awareness, there's no thought, there's no life in the physiological sense. So life in any of the senses that could apply to human beings would be impossible, consistent or requires change.
Mm-hmm.
So if nothing changed, then nothing would be alive.
I mean, let me give an example. Maybe this is too general when I say nothing changes. On some discussion concerning value of consciousness, Andrew Lee says consciousness is neither valuable nor disvaluable, and he gives these examples of ways of being conscious. One of which involves a subject on a world, and his only experience is that of slight brightness, and that's it, nothing else.
Just a human being, or
human being, yeah.
right.
I mean, would that be perhaps considered death within the, I mean, within the framework that you are talking about?
Oh, I see.
Mortality and immortality.
Okay, good. Yes, I haven't thought about that. I mean, I said rather glibly that to live forever is to continue existing in a conscious state forever. Okay, and you asked, okay, what do you mean by conscious? And I haven't got a good answer to that question. And maybe there are different ways of spelling it out. So this is a very minimal sort of conscious awareness that you're talking about in this case. If it is still you, if it's possible for you to exist in that condition, mm-hmm. then I suppose that would count as life in the sense I was talking about. Okay, it might not be very nice. Well, I don't know the details of the story. I don't know whether this person can get bored. I mean, if I had all of my mental powers except that all I could be aware of was this slight brightness, that would be pretty dull, and it wouldn't be very nice. And maybe this raises metaphysical questions about what is required for a person to continue existing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was inclined to think that was metaphysically impossible for someone to continue to have only this slight experience of brightness. But of course, his purpose is different. All he cares about is a comparison between a world where there's no consciousness and a world where there's consciousness, but its only form is this guy having slight brightness experience. So,
yeah, I'm not quite sure how to fill in the details of that story, because if I try to imagine what it would be like for me, all my senses go dark except my vision, and all my vision gives me is a slight brightness. That would be almost like complete sensory deprivation. but I'd still be alert and at least at first anyway, and wondering what's going on, how long it's going to last, and so on. That seems possible. I suppose it would be very undesirable, but I'm not sure whether that's meant to be part of the story or not. I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to notice that all I'm seeing is slight brightness and remembering how it was before and worrying about the future and so on.
Well, I mean, for in that discussion, it was that moment and that moment only like the moment of experience of slight brightness, and then continuing in that moment forever. But I mean, I as I said, I don't have I don't have anything to add, but it might be, not only could it be a form of death, it might also serve as a moment of perhaps immortality too. I don't know.
It sounds like it's a condition such that if you could be in it, it wouldn't be very nice. You wouldn't envy the person who was doomed to perceive slight brightness and nothing else forever. So if that's right, then it would be a form of immortality, though a very undesirable one.
Mm.
Not as bad as being burned, as burning in hell, perhaps.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? I guess not. Okay, well, we can perhaps end it then if there are no more questions. Okay, thank you, Eric, very much. Thank you for the talk.
Well, it was my pleasure. I hope it was entertaining and interesting.
Definitely.
Good.
I'm still like thinking about things, so I don't want to actually end, to be honest. But I guess it's time. So
If something else occurs to you, just drop me an email.
yeah, I will.
I'm still thinking about this, and this has been helpful to me as well. Thank you for your all your questions.
Okay, thank you very much then, and goodbye everybody, and thanks for joining.
I hope maybe sometime I can visit in person.
That would be great. Hopefully.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.